Good morning. So today, unlike yesterday, I'm going to introduce our panelists. To my left is Andrew Solomon, who wrote the book Far From the Tree. I think all of you know him. He's been an advisor involved. He's been an advisor on LGBTQ and, in fact, all issues, I think, for the department, meeting with the residents, and just an extraordinary contributor to our field, and we're so pleased to have you here today. Thank you. Class of '85. And then next to him is Rachel Dretzen, who's class of '87, and she and her husband are incredible documentary filmmakers. Rachel's the director of this movie, and we're extraordinarily thankful that you are here also today. Next, yeah, very good. I'm making very brief, and I'm apologizing, very brief introductions for the sake of time. So, next is Christy Olozeski, who is leading our program, the Pediatric Gender Program, and Associate Professor in the department. Let's clap for you two. And Jamie McPartland, expert in autism research in the Child Studies Center and leader of a large consortium on biomarker development in autism. Jamie, thank you also for joining us. So this is a group of people involved in treatment, and so maybe a good place to begin is with the process that people go through when they have a child that confronts their expectations to come to cope and then accept with the violation of their expectations. Yeah? Well, begin with that?
Well, sure. I think people set out to have children usually imagining what those children will be like. And what this film and the book that preceded it are engaged with is what happens when your child is born and upends all of the expectations that you had. And to some extent, that is the universal story of parenting. There is nobody whose children have turned out to be exactly what they anticipated. I have yet to meet parents who have not at some point looked at their child and said, "What planet did you descend from?" So it's really a universal experience. But we were particularly interested in making this film in how families are confronted with children who are different, are often traumatized by the sense that their child has a sort of major difference or aberration, and then become acclimated to that difference and end up feeling not only that they're able to accept it, but often that they're able to feel a lot of pride in it and a lot of pride in those children, and are able to say that having those children has given them a different life, often a more difficult life, but ultimately a very rewarding life. Now, there are obviously parents of children with differences who don't get to that point, and many children with special needs are available for adoption in the United States, and many parents of children with special needs struggle vainly and angrily against their fate. But we were interested in these stories, which in my own research have come to seem to me to be, in fact, the dominant story, which is that over time, at least, parents find that they're able to form deep and profound connections to children whom they would have done almost anything to avoid having, and are able to find rich and rewarding lives in their interactions with those children.
Were you surprised by the process that you encountered in these families?
I was a little bit, because having read Andrew's book, it was obviously mediated through Andrew's voice, and there were so many exquisite things that people said that were quoted in the book that it almost sort of boggled the mind to imagine that they were real. Of course, I knew they were, but when we started to meet people, I was quite amazed. We were initially randomly meeting families, and so many of them spoke very similarly to the families that Andrew quoted in the book, of lives that were profoundly meaningful, as a direct result of experiences that they had really feared. And that gave me personally the kind of resolve that those in fact were the stories we needed to be telling, which is not to say that the other stories don't exist. It's important that this film and the book not be seen as representative. You could speak for the book, but for the film, I would say that this was a choice, to look at lives in which a choice has been made to make meaning out of adversity. And we felt that was an important story to tell.
And that points to a study, I can't quote the footnote, but it's in the book, but there was a study in which a group of women who had just given birth, it's always the women who get these things, but a group of women who had just been given birth to children with a variety of challenges and special needs were asked, I think a week later, do you think you will find meaning in this experience? And then they were re-interviewed, the families were re-interviewed 5 years afterwards. And the children of people who had said that they anticipated finding meaning in the experience were doing better on every clinical measure than the children of parents who had said they did not anticipate finding any meaning in the experience. So the finding of meaning is something that's not only rewarding for the parents, but has also got really profound implications for how the children are going to develop and what their lives will be like.
What do you think the parents have to give up in order to come to terms with finding meaning or to go down that path?
Well, I think it's a matter not of so much of finding meaning, but of seeking out meaning. I mean, I don't think the meaning is sort of something that's just there waiting to be found, and some people notice it and some people don't notice it. I think there's an active will involved. There was one mother whom I interviewed for the book who had 2 children with very serious disabilities, and she said, people always give us these little sayings like, God doesn't give you any more than you can handle. But children like ours are not preordained as a gift. They're a gift because that's what we have chosen. And it was that process of choosing that became so interesting to me. Some people are able to make that choice. Some people are overwhelmed and unable to make that choice, but it is a choice and it involves an active will to make that choice. It doesn't just involve that you happen to stumble upon this meaning that's sitting there waiting to be unearthed.
I was thinking that we oftentimes will work with families that might not necessarily be there yet to really find the meaning and to really accepting their child. And oftentimes what we help, can you not hear? Oftentimes what we will do then is to help the, thank you, help the family kind of process all of this. And I think that it's totally normal for families to feel a sense of loss of what they were hoping for when they, mothers when they were pregnant, or individuals who were pregnant, what their expectations were, and trying to think about how those expectations might be different now that they have a child that they do, and working through that loss or fear of what might happen to their child, depending on what that ability is or that identity is, and working through also their own coming out and telling other people about their child and what their child is, who their child is, and also there can be a lot of conflict if parents don't necessarily agree on the path that should be there for their child. And I think that it's really important to help that parent find that place of acceptance and support. They might have to go through all of those different phases, and I don't think that they're linear, and I don't think necessarily that you kind of move out of a phase of fear and don't ever come back to it. So I think that that's also a process in finding support and love for one's child.
Sure, I think that one of the things, so in this second viewing of the film within just over 12 hours, one of the things that struck me was how different it is for different parents, the idea of finding what it is that you're going to love about your child and what it is that you're going to find difficult or easy to tolerate. And the story of the boy Jack with autism, his mother articulated it so explicitly, right? I mean, what was so important to her was eventually to have a way to communicate with him. And conversely, when she talked about being physically, struck by her child, which I think for many of us to watch is a very hard part of the movie to see, she apologized for historically taking it personally, which I can't imagine not. doing. But that was her take on it. And so I think it's the parents probably learn about themselves and figuring out what it is that they can and they can't handle about a child with differences.
And can I ask, I think one of the things that was so amazing to me in your book was the chapter talking about women who had been raped and had children of rape, and finding the acceptance in them, and that was amazing to see that point of view. And I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about that.
So Christy is alluding to the chapter in the book Far from the Tree, which I encourage all of you to read, in which I interviewed and looked at the structures of families in which people were bringing up children conceived in rape. And it was an emotionally agonizing chapter to write, and the stories that I heard were very shocking and very painful, but also often had ended up with an element of joy in them, but always a joy shadowed by a sense of tragedy and horror. I mean, I think of two moments that were to me moments of great clarity and revelation about the experience of those women. One was a woman I met who had been raped when she was 16 or 17, had been unable to pursue the dreams that she had for a career because she had to take care of this little baby, had really struggled with it. And I said to her, do you often think about the men who raped you? She was attacked by two men. And she said, well, you know, I used to think of them with great anger and hatred, but now I think of them with pity. And I said, pity just because they were so unevolved and they were such terrible people? And she said, no. She said, I think of them with pity because one of them has a beautiful daughter and two beautiful grandchildren, and he doesn't know that, and I do. And so as it turns out, I'm the lucky one. And I was fascinated by the trajectory that had led her to that. And then I went to interview women in Rwanda who had been raped during the genocide and who had been had managed to live through the genocide. And many of them had been taken as sexual slaves, and they'd been through unbelievable patterns of abuse. And there was one very beautiful Tutsi woman who I interviewed who had had a child of rape in the genocide. And when we finished the interview, I said, as I often do at the end of interviews, I said, do you have any questions for me? And mostly people in Rwanda had said, will this be published in French? And are you going to use my real name? And when will your research be completed? Those were the kind of questions people had asked. And this woman looked at me and said, well, you're in this field of psychology, right? And I said, well, yes, I am. And she said, can you tell me how to love my daughter more? She said, because I look at her and I want to love her, but seeing her reminds me of what happened to me, and that makes it very difficult. And I was so taken aback that I just stared at her, and she said again very insistently, can you tell me how to love my daughter more? And I thought that was such an extraordinary question. It was only a week later, too late to give the response to her, that I realized how much love there was inscribed in that very question itself. And so the nature of that love against steep odds became a theme there. And really the way it ties in with the other things I was looking at is, you know, what happens when you have a child who isn't what you wanted and isn't what you expected, and where there's an impediment to love, and how can you manage to build a relationship there? And that happens as much in that context as in any other that I was examining.
One of the things that I was struck by seeing the movie the second time was the confrontation with shame or guilt on the part of the parents for almost all of them. And I'm wondering how central that shame or guilt is to the ultimate outcome. Is that something that all these parents have to go through ultimately, or what's your sense of that in
Are you asking
Yeah,
me?
sure.
Oh, that's interesting. You know, I think it's something for those of us who are parents that we all experience on some level, perhaps in a microcosm of what you see on screen. I mean, I think the projection of ourselves onto our children and the sense of responsibility for who they become is something that all parents kind of wrestle with. And so I don't necessarily see the examples in the film. I see them as part of a continuum. But I do think it's almost inevitable that be a stage on the path to acceptance. I mean, you know, you almost do a process of elimination. It's like, how did this happen? You know, did I do something wrong? Did I eat something when I was pregnant or drink something when I was pregnant to cause this? And so I think it probably is part of the process of letting go, is sort of engaging in that question and ultimately, hopefully releasing it. I mean, unfortunately, some people don't. But it's hard to imagine parents not asking that question.
How about the other groups you work with?
Yeah, I think that parents oftentimes want to have an answer as to why something happened and how they can understand it a little bit more. And oftentimes I will hear parents say, did I do something? You know, is it because I'm a single mother, or is it because my child was around too many boys, or that they want to be a boy, you know, that they had more boyfriends or whatnot. And so I think that parents are always looking for a particular answer, and so I think part of our work that we do is helping them to sort of understand that it could be many different reasons, or there might not be a reason, and that they can still be able to move forward and accept and love their child for who they are, that we might not have that answer for them, and to be okay with that ambiguity in some ways, which is very difficult.
Yeah, I think it's very common. The first steps is feeling guilt and what did I do. I remember vividly one of the first children with autism that I assessed when I was in graduate school. After we talked about the diagnosis, the mother pulled me aside and said, you know, very quietly, there was different technology then. There are people in the room who won't know what I'm referring to, but while I was pregnant, I listened to a Walkman. Could that have done this? And, so yeah, I think that most people move past it, but I think it's a very, very common place to start.
I think a lot of people don't move past it. I think that narrative of self-blame is very central. And it relates to larger questions about how much of the character and nature and illness status of our children is linked to what we've done, and how much of it is linked to who they inherently are. And there's always a struggle that goes on to try to resolve the tension, the dichotomy between those 2 points of view. I mean, there was one woman I interviewed who was a highly educated woman who's been an autism activist for some years and very involved in the autism world, who said to me when I interviewed her, she said partway through, she said, well, she said, you know, it's really because I went skiing while I was pregnant. And I said, because of what? And she said the fast movement isn't good for a developing fetus. And I thought, okay, there are a lot of very confusing theories about what causes autism, but skiing is not one of them. And she had so internalized that narrative that she didn't even recognize that it ran in the face of all the scholarship she had encountered as an activist. There's this constant sense of sort of, I'm responsible for who my children are. And part of the purpose of the film in some ways, and of the book as well, was to liberate people from that narrow narrative, that narrative in which you felt that you did something and that caused this, rather than simply thinking this is what happened and I must figure out how to accept it and how to negotiate it.
We have a little time left if people in the audience would like to ask some questions. Sure.
Yes, thank you so much on the film. Just two comments. I think announcing the news or telling the parents what their child has the first time is a critical point in time. And pediatricians, as they are educated, to educate them, need to know that they have to consult. They'd rather consult with specialists before they announce, before they tell the parents what the child has. Because there's different ways of telling them that would help the parents or not help them in the future. That's one thing. The other thing is, in addition to shame and guilt, I think we need to think of anxiety as a major topic here. Because the parent is always confronted with the question of whether he or she is doing the right thing or not, in a more significant way when the child is different So that creates a specific anxiety that has to be examined and looked at and treated, perhaps.
Well, I think that's very true. I certainly think how physicians relate the news makes an enormous difference. We had a little panel last night when the film was shown to some undergraduates and community members, and I told the story of a family who had gone to see a doctor who was supposed to be distinguished in his field, who examined their child and then turned to the man without looking at the woman and said, "Take your pretty wife home and make yourselves another baby, because you'll never get anything out of this one." And that kind of delivery of information, even when it's not done in quite such a coarse and repulsive way, but the conveying of that point of view can have an enormous effect on how much the parents are going to work for and hope for what can happen for their children. And when the news is related in a more balanced fashion and a truer fashion, and describes both what will be difficult and what will be possible, and acknowledges the extent to which nobody knows what will be possible and nobody fully knows what will be difficult, that then gives the parents a much firmer grasp on hope. And parents who have a grasp on hope are able to be better parents to their children than parents who start off from a place of despair.
One of the things that struck me about the movie was how important it was for these people to find like tribes and communities, people who had similar experiences. But one thing I noticed was that like a lot of them had financial means that allowed them to find these tribes. So how do we build a structure that allow people with lesser means to kind of access these groups that allow them to feel like they have a family?
Well, it's sort of the joy and the peril of the internet. You know, you can now find community if you can log on. Not everybody can log on. Of course, there are people who are living in real poverty. It's important that people who are providing medical assistance also provide social existence, and it's important that networks get formed. I mean, Betty Adelson, who is the mother of someone with dwarfism, and who wrote 2 extraordinary books about dwarfism, described how she set up a network in which she asked all of the hospitals in the New York area, she lived in Brooklyn, she asked all the hospitals in the New York area, when you have a birth of someone who's a dwarf, or even a prenatal diagnosis that someone has dwarfism, call me or call any of this long list of people I've put together, and we'll go and talk to the family. And we'll say it's going to have some difficulties, but it also has some rewards, and this is what it looks like. Isolation is a terrible thing for people dealing with difficulty of any description, and the sense of community is terribly important. It's important for the people themselves, and it's important for the parents to know other people who've gone through these experiences, and for all the professionals can give very good advice. There is still a level at which the only real identifiable, fully engaged device is to find another family who said this. If you have more means, it's easier. I mean, if you have more means, most of life is easier. But there are online communities, and all of these people are exposed to social services situations of one kind or another, in the hospital where their child was born, on an ongoing basis if they recognize what they have rights to. And there are always possibilities there to generate community. And I think it's one of the fundamental imperatives for people who are working in a primary situation with people with these differences to help to foster and build that community.
Thank you for this movie. There were so many beautiful, interesting moments. I wanted to just ask you about one that I found particularly fascinating. There's the moment of the board meeting for the Little Peoples of America where they're discussing the research into prevention of dwarfism. And it struck me as such a fascinating moment because on the one hand, it makes complete sense that would threaten, in a way, a narrative, a sense of meaning. On the other hand, as mental health professionals, we are interested in studying ways to give people at least the option to prevent certain disorders. And I'm interested to know how all of you think about that kind of argument, in a way. How can you create a world, in my mind at least, that both supports people making the choice that they wouldn't want to prevent their child from having something like dwarfism, but other families would, and supporting both sides. I'm curious what you think about it.
Well, I think you're right that it is at the moment kind of crystallizes the tension of where we are right now. And this is happening, it's been true for a while that after an amniocentesis that diagnoses down, you can make that decision to terminate, and it's becoming true in all sorts of other ways with cochlear implants and this new drug. You know, I think a lot of what we need to do personally is just counter the prevailing narrative, which has been cure. It has been, you know, fix, and fix before really thinking much else. And so it's in raising, you know, awareness about the other part of the picture and the very satisfying lives that many people with dwarfism live. And, you know, to a certain extent, I think it can happen and is happening in the media. I mean, you see it with a film like this and in all of the reality shows about dwarfism, which for all of their sensationalizing have normalized it, I think, for a lot of people. And so part of it is, I think, a kind of popular awareness and giving voice to people who have an alternate point of view. I'm sure there are all sorts of other ways at it that maybe you guys can better address than I.
One of the things that I was thinking of is that we can really look at the movement and the disorders of sexual development and think about how we used to be in a time where individuals would be told that this is the option, is to have surgical intervention at birth. And there has been a very strong movement from individuals saying, you know what, no, this is not a good idea, we should wait because I want to have the choice as an adult or as, you know, an older person. And so I think that we really need to think about other movements that have gone before this and think about the ethical considerations in these options. I know we had a short discussion yesterday of, you know, how much does choice play into it, especially with the cochlear implants, and do you allow somebody to wait to have that done? I think that there's controversy on both sides. I think it's important, though, to think about all these different ethical considerations.
I think dwarfism is a tough example, but the principle, I think, is that you can treat the difficulties without treating the identity. And I think so if we take autism, for example, there's many people who think that treatments for autism are disrespectful to a culture that's evolved around autism. But in the film, for example, you could think that, you know, helping Jack, for example, with his auditory sensitivities would indubitably improve his life and maybe wouldn't decrease his ability to identify as a, you know, with a tribe of people with autism, as he puts it. And so I think it's one of the ways that I think about how we can, as we would for any of us or any person with any kind of difficulty, can we ameliorate the problems without messing around with the stuff that a person is okay with?
And ultimately, can we separate out the extent to which the problem itself is a medical problem and the extent to which the problem itself is a social problem? I mean, if you have dwarfism and you require multiple spinal decompression surgeries, that is a medical problem, and you can change social attitudes all you want and it will remain a medical problem. Nobody wants to have spinal surgeries repeatedly in childhood. If the problem with being a dwarf is that you get stared at and you get photographed when you're going through the ordinary business of your daily life and you don't get seen as a romantic object by any of the people you're in school with because you're seen as freakish, that's a social problem. And I think the question to some extent is how much we can use medical approaches to solve the medical problem and focus on social approaches to fix the social problem. You know, you can say that it's difficult in the United States as it's currently aligned to be a person of color, but nobody is suggesting that the appropriate response to that is to ensure that the next generation of children born to Asian or Latino or African American parents come out with blonde hair and blue eyes. We recognize that it's a social problem of racism and we need to address it. So how do we take the things and look at what is comparable to that problem of racism and what is actually a medical problem for which only a medical solution is useful?
I think that's a fitting end to our panel discussion. And I want to thank Andrew and Rachel for an extraordinary movie and for the opportunity that we've had to share it with them. So thank you so much for coming.